1990s. So in 2009, I was doing a show at the Whitney Museum and on Buckminster Fuller. I had this great idea. I was going to animate a Fuller, globule thing. But of course I couldn't do it. And the technology was different then. But everyone said, go to Michelle, she can do anything. So you know how ducks, baby ducks, like the first thing they see when they're born, they bond forever? Well, this was a duck moment for me. Michelle made this thing, this animation of a Fuller dome and how it was formed. And it was just one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. And she's been a superstar for me ever since. So in 2009, right after she graduated, she got a fellowship at the MacDowell Colony. And Michelle's work had always been kind of edgy in the sense, I think Sean hit it as we were talking, the attempt to get under systems of production and to understand how digital and non-digital systems of production and representation work so that you can manipulate them or at least understand them. I think getting under is the right thing. And that's something that at MacDowell she pursued and then got a fellowship in 2015. After that, I think, taught some, and then in 2015 got a fellowship at Rice University, where she remains teaching now as assistant professor. And a lot of the work we see today was produced at Rice. So it's the more recent work. And then finally at the Chicago Architectural Biennial, Michelle had a piece. The interest, you guys know, I think by now, that I'm interested while have the possibility of doing these things, interested in pushing the discourse of representation at the school to higher levels. And Michelle can certainly help us do that. It's something that Zaina, Jennifer, and others have already done. And we're going to continue this, and I want to understand it in that stream of things. So let me stop talking and welcome Michelle Chang.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for coming today. It's really exciting to be able to show you some of the things I've been working on and to share the ideas attached to them. Thanks especially to Michael for inviting me and that great introduction. I'm folding some of these ideas into a new seminar, so I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards too. To start, I'd like to show something familiar to explain the relevance of this title. This is a notation or sheet music to two songs. On the left, I Will Always Love You, written by Dolly Parton and sung by Whitney Houston. On the right, God Only Knows, written by Tony Asher and Brian Wilson, sung by the Beach Boys. Released decades apart, both songs follow a similar pop structure that is intro, verse, chorus, verse, bridge, chorus. But what I'd like to talk about is how they treat their tonal ordering systems differently. I Will Always Love You follows a conventional, or what I'll call a primitive, chord structure. It's part of what makes it so memorable. While God Only Knows has pervasive chord inversions, or what I'll call derivatives. The difference between a standard chord and its derivative happens through the rearrangement of the same notes to create a new acoustic form. So a lot of you probably know this. These are technically the same chord, but their parts have been rearranged to sit in a different tonal region. Not only does the Beach Boys song use several derivative chords, but it also employs multiple derivative scales. These are called musical modes that are diagrammed here. A typical pop song like I Will Always Love You will only use one mode. When we hear a standard scale, let me see. Oh, it stopped working. Hold on. There we go. It's in what's called the Ionian mode. However, there are several other modes like the Dorian, the Lydian, Phrygian, etc. that can add subtle tonal shifts. This is used frequently in jazz and in God Only Knows. To see the difference, I've isolated where each song uses primitive chords. This is a little bit misleading because there's a very long solo intro, but that happens a lot more on the left than on the right. And here I've isolated all the times derivative chords are used, so much more in God only knows. Their use masks any jarring shifts and chord changes, which also helps preserve its poppiness. Stop working. To hear the difference, I've shifted the pitch of a phrase so you can hear it in its primitive and derivative states. Stop working again.
I may not always love you. I may not always love you.
And to hear the two phrases in their primitive states side by side.
I may not always love you. We'll always love you.
So I'd argue that despite its formal complexities, the Beach Boys song is still a derivative of a conventional structure. I think it's good in the sense that it's productive in creating new effects and complex relationships between form and content. For example, chord shifts between the denial and the affirmation of love, like I may not always love you, but you should never doubt it. They're almost imperceptible because there are so many translations happening. But I don't think that the derivatives are necessarily a better way of working. It's just that it can do different things compositionally than straight pop. The projects I'm going to show today are an attempt to work in a similar way by playing with architecture's pictorial structures. That is, reconfiguring relationships with representational frameworks, I think, is a way to operate within and without conventional perceptions and conceptions of the environment. Specifically, I've been thinking about how Panofsky's comparison of antique and Renaissance perspective set up different relationships between form and space. In Perspective as Symbolic Form, he wrote something that I found really interesting, which is up here, that the totality of the world always remained something radically discontinuous. I think he was referring to antique perspective, which I've diagrammed on the left, and the way of seeing that was set up by an antique sense of optics. This was contrasted with linear perspective propped up by a Renaissance way of seeing that orders form and space with a consistent projection towards a single spectator point. The way antique perspective is set up implies a couple of things. One, that things in space have no homogenizing order because they're projected in all different ways. And you can see the arc. And two, finding the form of things is primary, and space is considered the leftover of all of those things. Only when linear perspective comes about do form and space find a dualistic or even relationship. Those rationalizing lineaments define boundaries between form and space in a constant way. So like these examples, the three projects I'm going to show are interested in how to alter one's environment by playing with representational structures. They're an attempt to figure out how contemporary techniques are derivatives of Panofsky's ideas of space. And the three projects in the right three columns are House AB, Noise, and Deep Color, and I'll explain this diagram as I go along. The first project, House AB, questions the role of perspective and optics in the process of computer rendering. It looks to specific geometric constraints within the rendering process to design a building. So to explain how this works, there's a process in computer rendering that is a derivative of linear perspective called the perspective transformation. It projects a view that is identical to perspective in 2D but distorted in 3D. To understand, it's important to note that the rendering process privileges efficiency and 2D likeness over correct 3D geometry. So here's linear perspective up top that is at A, that is transformed to perspective transformation below, which is B. Perspective spectator point that is tied to the rays intersecting with the picture plane and then to the object is in effect dilated. The spectator point becomes a spectator plane. This makes it easier to calculate light in the rendering software, but it also distorts the original object to this. Though it appears similar to anamorphosis because there's only one view where the object is true to form, And it also seems similar to parallel projection because it casts parallel rays. It's neither. What's intriguing to me about rendering and all this is that it rigorously defines the perceptual compensations and rules based in things like art and optics and psychology. So this house design takes alternate ways of seeing the box in the design of a single-family house. In this and in the following projects, the pictorial structure is understood as a derivative of perspective. That is, in one, how it works optically and technically. So that's the first two rows right here, in a top view and a side view. Two, the relationships it sets up between form and space. And three, the kinds of subjectivities it creates. While the other two projects focus more on subjectivity, perception, and optics, this one uses the derivative to work through relationships between form and space in the design of circulation and the sequencing of rooms. So really quickly, to explain this diagram, perspective transformation is similar to linear perspective in that it abstracts the total environment with a constant distortion. So I would say that form and space here have a similar dualistic relationship, which is this black and white dot below the first two row of diagrams. And because the spectator point is dilated to a plane, the picture represents what I would say is a collective subject instead of a single viewer, which is the group of dots at the bottom. The house was designed by oscillating between perspective and perspective transformation, A and B, back and forth. And in doing so, I'm thinking about going between multiple versions of a house. This row of diagrams shows the passive translation from those two modes. And to test the limits and to start to exaggerate that, the model was projected back and forth a whole bunch of times. The effects of this kind of apparatus not only distort three-dimensional forms, but when you look at multiples, it creates different relationships between objects. So here, the three couples are all corresponding to the same picture, but one's attached, this one's detached, attached, attached. And so to develop this, I took one of these pairs. And here's how it began to manifest into a building. In the plan, you'll see the new cube as if it had been looked at twice. The areas of overlap are kind of the more domestic rooms, like the bedrooms, bathrooms, living room. And the leftover from that overlap is mostly circulation. So that is, I brought my laser. The entrance hall from the front door, a stair that goes to the third floor observatory, and the regulating lines coming from these translations gives way to a strategy for developing the circulation through the house. So let's say this corridor to the outdoor room, or a way of getting through here. With the help of a research assistant, her name is Stephanie, this model was used to investigate these translations in 3D. It was continually built and unbuilt, packed and unpacked, to see how that would work spatially. So that entrance hall circulation that wraps around the house, you can see it here. And some of the superpositions or overlaps create ruptures in the form. For instance, this overlap that becomes a dormer with a window that looks onto an exterior court, and the circulation down below. Sometimes it stops working. Okay. After doing this speculative project, I was given the chance to build the model at a much, much larger scale. Here I was investigating similar problems in how the construction of a picture can influence we think about architectural boundaries, and also how it can help us think about domestic space. This is a photograph of the same house at 1:2 scale. So the previous model was 16, so 48 times bigger. And in working on this project, this is at Rice, the model was built at 1:2 and sliced down the middle so that there could be a window onto the interior shown to an audience. The way this worked is I hired a contractor, local guy named John, and he built out all the frame and then sheathe the entire thing in drywall. After he did that, I went in with an idea about a way to articulate it that I'll explain in a second, and use newsprint to sheathe that installation. So because the model was 1 to 2, all the members were sized down, so instead of 2x4s, 1x2s. And then everything was paneled in a kind of monochromatic gray, which is the drywall. Afterwards, I went in to add a higher level of detail, and the idea was, instead of thinking about the domestic space as defined through material coding, let's say carpet or wood or tile or finishes, I was interested in dealing with different levels of detail as shown in this diagram. So levels of detail replacing the idea for material finishes as a way to set boundaries in a domestic space. The sheets of newsprint were folded at different dimensions according to what I was calling like high and low levels of detail. So I don't know if you can read it, but high has many more folds, low has lower, and that was the idea of how to set the boundaries. What happened was, in the picture plane, that's where all the detail was. So in the round, in the back of the installation, it was pretty rough, very plain and rude. This picture is just to show the scale of it. But in the picture window, the idea was to create a kind of an idea of articulation. And it's better shown here. So some of those folds start to appear as kind of undulations reminiscent of a tectonic, like floorboarding or nosing of a stair, or maybe even a chair rail, but it's somewhat vague. I think the possibility of using this perceptual framework is that boundaries can be set by architecture's effects or can be understood by them, like light and color, as much as material coding, like wood versus drywall versus molding. In other words, this approach takes into account the contribution of light and distance in the perception of form. Okay, so the second project, it's on noise. With the design of another house, I was interested in how and also why the noise filter introduces randomness into an environment. Here we move away from lines and projection to the pixel grouping found in raster graphics. I'll go into this a little bit more later, but whereas linear perspective prioritizes a single subject in its consistent distortion about a spectator point, I think antique perspective and the way noise works in a raster structure supports multiple subjectivities. As opposed to antique perspective that does this with multiple spectator points and multiple projections, in 3D, noise does this with a convolution of regular patterns in a flat field. Here I'm working with a 2D graphic to design a building. So just to start for the how, noise filtering uses mathematically generated images to give rendered surfaces a naturalistic texture. Though it appears disorderly, looking closer, I realized that the pattern follows a series of repeatable geometric principles. So let's say something like a plane cube would get a layer of noise to look a little bit more gritty and a little bit more real. So those geometric principles that I was starting to try to tease out, if you take something regular, like this checkerboard on the top left, and shift the pixels of that checkerboard along irregular curves that are generated by, stay with me, a series of random vectors at the intersections, so like these, and these make curves. The clean edges between black and white get mixed up or convoluted. In most modern day noise algorithms, this operation sets the position of a black and white gradient instead of black and white squares that is then smoothed out or interpolated into a continuous field. This field is then overlaid onto images, it's overlaid onto surfaces and volumes. For example, something like these bananas, or this picture of bananas, could be given some texture, some grit. or it could be used spatially to propagate them in a seemingly random way. So that's for the how. For the why, I think something to consider is why noise has positive connotations in rendering. Whereas photographs or images can have an epistemic value to record the real world, renderings have value in constructing the real world. In other words, the technical challenge in rendering is more towards the production of a realistic environment rather than towards its reproduction, I'd say. And so in this way, under this logic, noise reveals the technical limits of a camera, while it shows off how something like a rendering could act natural. The general assumption embedded in this way of working is that the world is random and it's disorderly. An example, the kind of noise I'm looking at, specifically Perlin noise, was invented for the specific purpose of making the lighting in the 1982 movie Tron look less clean. The added grittiness in Tron's lighting, you can see in the costumes, made the transitions between the film shots and the rendered scenes less jarring. So I don't know if you've seen this, but some of the car shots that are rendered had a little bit of grit to the lighting in transitioning to the film scenes that became a little less different because of noise. So after going down this technical rabbit hole, I started to design a house with something stable and clear, which is a grid, and then added noise. This project looks at how spatial relationships can be affected by the placement and the geometry of openings like doors, windows, niches, recesses, things like that. So to start, I was looking at a regular grid and trying to see what effects could be made with the application of this noise at a fine and a coarse grain. So at a really fine grain, you can start to see a very flat texture as an effect. And I should say on the left, it's been applied to a checkerboard, and on the right, it's been applied to a grid, which will become a little bit more clear. At a little bit of a coarser grain, you can start to see the patterning and the movement of the pattern. At an even coarser grain, that becomes less apparent, and I would say maybe the intersections become a little bit more prominent. And at the coarsest grain I was looking at, that goes away, and something like the texture of a line becomes kind of interesting, which is what I was into. So at a fine grain, architecturally, I think it could work like this, object in a field, or a way of thinking about sight. This thing keeps popping up. Or at a coarse grain, I think it could work like this. Here's some just patterning tests that I was working on. The top row was looking at how, in plan, shifts in scale might create opportunities for dealing with things like apertures, thresholds, niches, and recesses. And the bottom two rows looking at how that same procedure could give way to an idea about windows, doors, or even a kind of tectonic approach that would create a kind of disorder. I started with one of them on the ground floor, and with this, I was always thinking about how that might relate to an enfilade 2x3 grid. In this model of the ground floor, I think it's easiest to see how that began to manifest. Subtle shifts in the bends and the changes in scale became, okay, I'm gonna point with a laser. Windows, like here, niches that might correspond to, this is actually a fireplace and a fire pit, a break in the wall that becomes the entrance, a niche that becomes something that would service a stove, and then larger changes in scale could hide or hold smaller rooms like bathrooms, and larger ruptures could be a way of resolving the circulation, and this is a winder stair to the second floor. If you look at the plan, applying noise to a regular domestic arrangement produces a series of misalignments and rotations rendering an approximation of an enfilade plan type. Discrete spaces like these outdoor rooms, or the kitchen, or the reading room, or the bedroom are all loosely arranged. And the openings between them, I think, are contingent on the wall's shifts and bends. Here's that stair that I was talking about before that resolves the patterning of the ground floor and the second floor. Here's the bedroom, and a different graphic was used to create different opportunities for windows and to hold things like toilets and a washer and dryer. Here's the roof plan. That outdoor room that I was talking about before has an opening in the roof, and the reading room from before has a skylight. Not only was I interested in how the way of working could create different scales through the circulation or to hold different aspects of a house, I was also interested in how that could create a way of thinking about the exterior massing, especially in the way those shifts and bends might break away to create different sort of ways of thinking about the scale of the building. This is a section through the kitchen and the reading room. And here's another section through the winder stair that goes up to the bathroom. But you can start to see here, and a little bit better actually in the model, where those shifts and bends create a kind of split in the house, an implied datum line, where sometimes the planes are coplanar that reveals a kind of bigger scale, and sometimes it breaks away to do something like make a window or make a door. It's a little bit easier to see what I'm talking about in elevation. Here's that break because of the two graphics. And in this model here, sometimes the planes are coplanar or they break away. This is the aerial view of the backside of the house, where you can see those skylights that I was talking about before and some of the windows. And here is a view onto the interior of the reading room and looking up the stair. What interests me about noise as a spatial construct is that it creates a kind of complexity that places the spectator in what I'd say is two different environments. I think it's kind of like a knot. Convoluted formal relationships confound an immediate visual apprehension. In doing so, I think they make one the perceivable space that one is in the real world, and also two, an imagined space one inhabits when trying to figure out something kind of tricky. Okay, so to go back a little, if antique perspective favors form over space, I think it also implies a collective subject with its many vanishing points, or a set of implied many vanishing points. If perspective props up a way of imagining form in space that is dualistic because its distortion is constant and totalizing, I think it also implies a single subject. The way I've been thinking about contemporary ideas of space vis-a-vis digital images or the proliferation of them in architecture is that we've shifted from geometric optics into physical optics. Whereas geometric optics abstracts light into a series of rays, which gives way to projection. Physical optics abstracts light into a series of waves. It's how we think about rainbows, for example, or the color spectrum. Under this framework, distinctions between form and space are muddied in images because they've been put on the even field of a pixel grid. With the loss of projection, there isn't an implied leftover or an implied negative in an image's pictorial structure. So instead of a dualistic relationship like perspective, images collapse distinctions between form and space and are maybe more mono. And I'll go into that a little bit. So in thinking about what kind of subjectivity that creates, I think it makes many subjects because form finding or boundary finding is dynamic and is also uncertain. So the last project, which will be a lot quicker, I was investigating how that shift might have implications on how we see and make forms. Again, the representational structures I'm using in the 3 projects are understood as derivatives of perspective, just to help me think about them and how they work technically, the relationships they set up between form and space, and also the kinds of subjectivities they imply. As opposed to the other projects that leaned more on form and space or subjectivity and perception, this one concentrates more on the shift towards physical optics. So deep color, the last thing, is something I've been working on and off for the last couple of years, and it came about from a seminar I was teaching on architectural shadow casting. This project is a little bit more in progress and speculative than the other 2. So to explain, like the other ones, there's a common rendering technique called normal mapping that uses color to simulate form, just color. It's a lot like texture mapping on the left, in the sense that a pixel's color value correlates to a geometric offset from a plane. You guys probably know this. But instead of working in black and white or in grayscale, normal mapping uses red, green, and blue to work 3-dimensionally. So that added color allows for something to become much more in the round. Something else that's different about this way of working is that constructing a picture doesn't require a 3D form, so geometry is lost or can be lost. I'll explain that. Normal mapping detaches a naturalistic sense or conception of light in favor of a color system that indexes Cartesian space. Though this is a contemporary technique, modeling with a false sense of color isn't really new at all. Okay, whoa. A lot of stuff going on. Okay. In the Renaissance, substituting unnatural hues in shadowed areas, like what you see on the left, was typical of one of the canonical painting modes. Here's an application of that mode, cangiante, in Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel pendentive. So if you look at the pendentive here, I don't know if you can see it, but there is a green fabric, and if you imagine light being cast from the right, the shadowed areas are red. They should be green. That's kind of typical of cangiante. The newer example on the right is the false color technique used in satellite imagery. So satellites can pick up a huge range of light on their sensors, and imaging is a process of compositing those layers of information. In a way, they're a lot more like data visualization than photographs. So here, there's an image of the Salton Sea in California that applies false coloring to show the location of infrared light, which is invisible to us. Instead of mapping the wavelengths naturally, the color spectrum has been shifted over, so infrared looks red in the picture up top, but it's invisible. To explain how normal mapping works, imagine a color space that goes from shades of blues and reds and greens based on the angle a surface rotates from a picture plane. So a faceted sphere on the left that has the sort of placement of red, green, and blue would look like what's in the middle. The color image then can be read by the rendering software to then simulate a sphere without the geometry. You can then put lights in that scene with that plane, and it'll simulate something that would look like on the right, a sphere that is in shadow. The discrete color values here index rotations about the X, Y, and Z axes like this. I got really into this for a while and started to chart out the rotations about the X, Y, and Z axes in different values between red, green, and blue to see if there was any kind of pattern, which, of course it was. But here's a small sample of that. Having a familiarity with these colors, as a lot of people do who are designing computer games, for example, would allow for one to work directly with an image to model form, just like skipping geometry, basically. So what I wanted to show you to end is a couple of tests I did with this idea. The first was to see if one could develop a technique for modeling with lights in the real world, and the other was to see if one could pull an object out of its context and to understand its form with this system. In other words, what I wanted to see was how this might operate as a way of making things with a known and a kind of unknown object. So the more familiar example, this is just a door. Using that system of lights that was diagrammed previously, placing a series of light bulbs in specific locations to simulate that color system. Putting that into the rendering software, what I wanted to see was how close it was to the real thing, which it was, except for the areas in shadow, which started to become red as form. The second test I did was somewhat similar, taking photographs of just paper cylinders under different lighting conditions, applying a layer of color that then a sort of additive process to get into that color mode. Taking that image and putting it into the rendering software and casting lights onto that plane to try to understand what errors and what kinds of manipulations could happen in kind of understanding how it was reading the image. And then the last thing was the object taken out of context. This is a photo I just found online of Charles Ray's relief sculpture, Light from the Left. And I wanted to see, in putting it in a different context through casting of light, what that might inform me. Anyway, so in that photo from online, there's a series of highlights and shadows from the gallery where that picture that was taken, actually probably the Art Institute in Chicago. And overlaying a specific color system to the highlights and the lowlights and the shadows, I put that back into the rendering software, using a system of artificial lights, started to just sort of cast shadows around it and began to see how that form looked in 3D through a system of just like images. So one way of describing the collapse or integration of form and space that happens in the raster framework is to compare it to a kind of monophonic production. So what I was talking about before. This is a picture of the Wrecking Crew. It's a group of session musicians that did a lot of the instrumentation for pop artists in the 60s and the 70s. They famously worked with the producer Phil Spector on songs like Be My Baby, You've Lost That Love and Feelin', to develop the wall of sound production style. Brian Wilson later went on to adopt this method with God Only Knows. As opposed to prop production methods that came before it, the wall of sound is characterized by layering of many, many instruments, and that makes a full-on effect. So instead of hearing a piano or a sax solo like you would in I Will Always Love You, many harmonies are played with many pianos, woodwinds, brass section, chorus, string section, whatever, at the same time. The recording also doesn't simulate space by tracking some of the melodies to the left speaker and some of them to the right speaker. Everything is played the same on both speakers, making space really flat. With the wall of sound, distinctions between compositional strands are blurred into what can be understood as dense musical textures. Color mapping, and I think a lot of the raster techniques are like this kind of mono mode because they even out the clear borders between form and space. With images, form finding is a soft approximation of pixel groups. To end, the idea of space propped up by antique perspective or by antique optics is that the world is continuous, whereas the idea of space in the Renaissance, supported by the prevalence of linear perspective, is that the totality of the world is continuous. From Panofsky, The notion is that while these two customs of seeing create different relationships between form and space, subject-object, those boundaries are clearly defined. In many ways, imaging is aimed at kind of finding an exactitude in the vagueness of picturing real things. But instead of abstracting the way we see according to geometric rays and hard edges like drawing, I'd say that raster imaging seeks formal definition in the fluctuating light field of waves. What's form or space in that sense is uncertain. It's brought out by analysis and not something inherent to the mode of representation itself. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was great. So we have actually, some of you will have to leave at 1, but we have some more time, and I really want to explore some questions, turn this into a kind of seminar, but I do need help. So let me, I don't have the whole thing organized yet,
Sure.
but let me tell you some places that I think I would like to go. There were 2 comparisons that I kept trying to hold in my head to try to structure a way of discussing and analyzing this. One was, who's taking BTC this year? No, none of you. No, because we added it just this year. We look now at Bramante's Cortile, the courtyard of Santa Maria della Pace, and what's important, you can imagine it. We're thinking about the interior corner. And it's an ionic arcade. And the issue is that he wanted the geometry and I would say the space, in the sense that you were using that antique perspective doesn't actually produce its own space. It produces form, but not space. Mm-hmm. And Renaissance, the Renaissance, one of the issues of perspectival space is that you want the geometry and the space to reinforce each other. So for him, the geometric grid, it's just a simple grid of the arcade and the interior corner had to be pure. Mm-hmm. And so the only way to get that is that the last ionic pilaster at the corner passes into its twin on the other side. So what you get is this little blip, this tiny little scroll from the 2 ionic, you get the scroll. And it's if you really look at it, it'll kind of makes the hair on the back of your head stand up. It's so exciting because in a way, it's a failure, right? It's not pleasing. But what's exhilarating about it is that the system has started to undo itself through its rigor rather than through a mistake or through lack of rigor. And it's absolutely exhilarating. So one of the questions I want to pursue, this isn't a question yet because I don't know how to frame it quite, but one of the questions I want to pursue is that in the kinds of things you're working with, can you begin to feel and perceive the limits of the system, however the system is constructed, so that you know when it's about to fail and can push, and what would be the parameters of that?
Yeah.
Okay, so something like that. Okay. So that's one thing. And then, and part of what that has to do with, it seems to me, is kind of an intellectual control that sorry, I'm coming off a cold, guys, so excuse me. The other thing I tried to compare it to get a handle on it was serial music, dodecaphonics, which you hinted at with the Brian Wilson. And so what you lose in going from an 8-tone row to a 12-tone row and leveling all the value, what you gain is the ability to codify and serialize and randomize. You can randomize pitch, you can randomize tempo, you could even randomize dynamic volume, you can randomize anything, but what you lose is melody. You lose the ability to control. You can't do I Will Always Love You. Yeah, you can't do pop. And so what musicians, as I understand it, then what they do is that they nevertheless have to control. You end up producing accidents, but then you control the accidents to produce the emotional effect or the affective dimension that you want. So the two questions together, or the two examples together, first leads to, are you in control of this? You say you lose geometry. You lose geometry in some of these. But can you control it, and can you there, through a kind of control, make decisions about the effective consequences of this? Or is it completely aleatory, which is another way of doing it, right? It's just completely aleatory, it's completely contingent, it's completely random, and I'm not trying to control it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I think that the example you gave is really interesting in the limits of a kind of technical structure being revealed perceptually in the round, and that it would be, from what I understand, biased towards the playing out of a totalizing system and some kind of error coming from that. And in some of the projects that I was working on, I think that happens, or I try to get that to happen as much as possible. And maybe it's not in the same way that there is a singular moment where there is a blip or a revealing of the limit of the technical and the perceptual, but a kind of multiplicity of that. So let's say in the noise project, the point where something like noise that typically you want to make a very smooth field is pushed to the point where it starts to create those jagged edges, right? I was really interested in that as a way of thinking about a figure ground and ideas of scale. And so that's just like multiplied as much as I can multiply it across the entire design. And so that idea is really interesting to me, but I think it's just multiplied so it produces more of an effect than a singular moment of revealing the technical. And the idea of the music, I think, is less about an aleatoric approach, but in understanding these different modes of picturing the environment, trying to figure out what the assumptions are behind them, what you lose, but also what you gain. So in a lot of this stuff, you gain effect, or you gain an idea of a different way of thinking about some sort of temporal aspect of sequence, but you lose clarity. And I guess, I don't know. I mean, that's really interesting to me, how that would play out.
Could you go to the model of noise, the
physical model?
The physical model.
Yeah.
And you guys, please, at some point, jump in. So before I understood this project, as I was just looking at some of your work, just the photograph I stopped on it. I found it very compelling, but I couldn't decide why. And hearing you now, I have two questions. The worry, at least at Descaret's, its sort of level of teaching, is that you get interested in a student who's pursuing some of this stuff, but then in the end, and I don't, maybe this is just my problem, the program always, in a way, gets stuffed in, because what you're really interested in is how this is going to play itself out, and then you start, you have to present, and you start stuffing in program. So the first question is, in something like a house where this is really going toward occupation, how do you coordinate program and formal transformation?
Yeah.
And again, I'm asking the audience this in a way: is part of the attraction of a project like this not? Is it not, at least in part, simply distortion from a known norm? The fact that this is it's not a 9-square grid, but it's close.
Yeah.
It's a 9-square rectangle.
Uh-huh.
It's got stairs and toilets and kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
It's typological. So part of its intrigue to me is just a distortion from a type. And if we didn't have the type, it wouldn't be as legible.
Right.
And is the answer to that the same thing, that you start from something, a typological condition that's distorted, including program, or is program on your table of concern?
Yeah.
And then
I think, or can I answer that first? Okay. I think the way in which I think about something like a house starts with maybe a rough abstract type, but really it's more about scale and the repetition of certain scaled rooms and the exceptions that are produced from a totalizing system like noise as a way of thinking about program. What I mean by that more specifically is that it's not really an awful lot anymore because so many exceptions have been made with the apertures or with the, like here and here, these areas. The larger kind of rooms that were turned into bathrooms. So that gives way to a programmatic approach that comes from the system. So I would say program comes after, but that's how I think of it. The exceptions to a kind of repetition or a kind of order that are or become things like bedrooms or become things like living spaces.
And a stair in that category, or a stair more with the other category? You know, does the stair belong to kitchen and toilet, or does the stair belong to the basic?
The basic, I
Yeah.
think, yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Zena, did you?
Is it on? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's weird. Thank you, Michelle. That was wonderful. So last year, well, spring, we had a set of talks around representation and, let's say, the emerging issues of representation in our field. And there was a particular event that Catherine Ingram put together about Neo-Sh media. And so I think the students are familiar with the kind of this tone of that we ought to now consider images as part of our process, right? Or let's say the raster image needs to be taken seriously as something that is as generative as the line or the projected line. So I'm just going to kind of reiterate that to the students in the room that in general that this sort of argument of the kind of raster image in a way has been made for us, and now we can work with it comfortably. So I'm in a way sympathetic, you know what I mean? But there's always this interesting question that comes up about how, let's say, our process, the process from moving, from image to architecture, is different or similar to, let's say, the transformation project of, let's say, Eisenman, right? The kind of translation of lines or syntax and its iteration, right, into some kind of architectural object that is self-referential and that we can now talk about, but that is completely devoid from program in a way, but that can find itself into a domestic program. Like it can find itself into a home, and then if the stair ends up in the ceiling in house 10, that's okay, because the conversation is about the transformation of the line. So anyway, very kind of obvious observation, but I just want to ask this on behalf of the students, like how do you think the process from the raster or the techniques of the raster, whatever you've been working on, whether it's noise or deep color, how do you think that is different, let's say, from the project of the Eisenman-esque transformation project?
Sure,
You know what I mean?
yeah.
And how does that lead to a type that is distorted and kind of transformed.
Yeah.
Thank
yeah.
you.
Thanks for your question. No, it's great. I think maybe the first part, I mean, on one hand, I think it's just kind of all the same, just different assumptions and different techniques, but it's all just different ways of picturing the environment. So the raster has different terms, and let's say something that is more Eisenmanian. That's one half that I'll kind of talk about. And then the second is that to bridge something maybe like more abstract to something more real, how do you make that more significant through something like program? The way I think about it is that the pictorial structures, if we really try to understand them, set up a bias in how we think about the environment at large, which may mean how we think about boundaries, which may mean how we think about sequencing, or how we think about like a foreground and background. So in the first part, I think that the terms are quite different for something that is based in a projective system that comes from a geometric way of thinking rays than a raster system. That to me is really interesting as a shift. If we think about everything as a kind of energy, or everything as a pliable positive instead of positive negative, this sort of dualism all the time, that to me is like pretty different if we really take this seriously. And then second, I guess, I forgot already, but oh right, yeah, the program is something I really struggle with, because I think it's always a kind of foil for making something good, right? Making like solving something, and I don't think that you're saying that, but the way I think that interests me is in how we set up limits between different groups of, I don't know, acting, different kinds of performance, and I think that's kind of how program works anyway. And in the changing between different pictorial structures, those limits, I think, are defined on really different terms. And so we could apply that, I think, to something like program or the environment. Thanks.
But I mean, if I think we have to bring program into it, because I'm thinking of I can't think of any good examples from movies, but you know how movies often take very current experiments in architecture and form and use it in a more decorative way just to signify future or signify cool or whatever. And you always get these bars with LEDs and, you know, rhino-formed curves. And decorators quite easily, and they're good and they're fun and you can make money making them, right? So it does seem like to me that that performing in a space for most people means attending to programmatic activities that should be brought into the control of any architecture, not just contingent as like Eisenman stare, right? Because it seems like to me we should make it in the same way that a musician can bring, I don't know, even a serialist composer worries about the timbre of the violin as opposed to the flutes, right? And that's not program, but it's a level of texture and it's a level of experience that matters. And so it seems like, well, and so with that, I was wondering, and this projects too far, but it's only because I haven't formulated the next question I wanted. Can you imagine this in the deep color? And I was thinking immediately, I think of the deep web and what all might lie. Actually, what does that mean? Actually, the underneath, and with Sean's getting under, and I wonder if one could bring in sound, temperature, something about materials more than color. But well, you mentioned that you coded. In some of the projects, you do code material, carpet, wallpaper. Would that be on the table for future work, that you don't just bring in the walls and the floors and the ceilings, but you actually bring in the temperature of the room, maybe sound and form could actually like cross media resonance, if that would ever be something you would consider. The point being, does perception matter or only
Visual?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Maybe to the first part about the program or the timbre. I think there is something about the sequencing of a proportion of spaces. I mean, maybe this is like kind of too basic to say, but the sequencing of a proportion of spaces or the sequencing of like a repetition of even spaces that does the same thing as something like an LED counter, right? Like, and maybe that's like at a different scale, but that's really how I think of program, just volumetrically or whatever. But in terms of whether it's about a total perception, I think these representational frameworks are, for me, models with which I can understand different constructs perceptually and conceptually about space, but they don't necessarily have to index different modes of perception. Like, I don't think that the way in which the color field works would necessarily have to codify something that happens in music, which I think if we were looking at this, there are a lot of things in music that are probably much more advanced than how we use it. But maybe that the idea of mono would mean that a multitude of perceptual effects would exist all at once, and the visual would be the kind of more primary. It's more what I'm interested in.
Okay, guys. Yeah, Zana, and then
This guy right there. Okay.
Yeah, just one last note. It was really interesting how you very rigorously describe the techniques, right, of your processes, and then do a kind of parallel to our understanding of systems of notations in music or the techniques of producing digital music, right, that emerged in the 60s and is now alive and well. How do you think describing with such specificity how things work and then using parallel creative fields, like music, helps understand the architectural object? Meaning, is it necessary? Do we need to know how the techniques in the process unfold and its linearity and its kind of back and forth to understand this physical model on the wall?
Yeah, I would hope not. I mean, meaning I would hope that the design of a building could stand alone, and the way in which you would evaluate it would be moving through the building itself. But I think it's, just the type of talk for a type of audience. And I wanted to give this type of talk for this type of audience. But really, I think it should go without saying. I would hope, but,
Lisa.
I have a related question, 'cause I love,
It's just because it's documentation.
Oh, I'm so. I feel so awkward. I love that half-scale model that you built, and my question was about the limits. Like, where do you stop, or where do you consider the end of the project to be?
Yeah.
Because for me, it was like a whole, like, that was like the beginning of the conversation. Because obviously, especially when you have that amazing shot of people looking through it, and it's like that awkward half-scale. Like, they could sit in that chair, but they'll break it. That to me, that itself like opens up a whole nother conversation about those people and their bodies in relationship to that model. That you could like continue to translate or to see as part of the architectural work in the process. So my question for you is where do you see that as stopping? So like, would you take an image like that and like continue working through it? Obviously, it would have to be with a totally different set of constraints than perspective, because you're asking people to stand in front of that model and like move their bodies in relation to that house that's totally different from how you conceived of it.
So the way I did it was limited by a single vantage point. I didn't want to go into the technical aspects of that whole project, which is based on, I I don't know if I should go into it now, but something called binary large object detection, blob detection, that's used a lot in surveillance. But I don't think that's really the question. It's like, how many times do you need to do this process in order to say when is enough?
Or even just like looking at that image of those people in front of their mini chairs and say like, what is this telling us about the way we think about architectural modeling, the way architectural images are working
Yeah.
in an environment? Like I think that was in Salted Rice, right? Like,
Yeah.
what is this doing pedagogically
Yeah.
at that particular scale?
Yeah.
And not even necessarily that there's a new iteration of the building,
Yeah.
but that's like asking us to question the way we think about architectural representation in general.
Yeah.
And like, what's the next step then?
Yeah.
Kind of question.
So, to be super honest, I think because I was in installation at Rice, I wanted it to be kind of didactic as much as I wanted it to be something that would develop certain techniques that I could use in a building. And so the application of certain kinds of boundaries, I wanted to be more clear or singular than I think would exist in a real building that, you know, has all of the layers of habit and routine. In that case, I don't know when the limit would be, but it would probably have to do with program in a way, and thinking about the repetition of seeing some of these layers over and over and having to make that a little bit more excessive than how I did it in that installation.
Sorry, you had a question I skipped over. Yeah. I really don't want to come back to that.
Hi. So I guess I have a question about software. So a lot of the techniques you're pulling out in these are kind of deep dives into some of the fundamental aspects of rendering, things that are like hidden underneath like many, many layers of commands and tools and things that we just take for granted.
Yeah.
Are you like, to what extent do you have to go back in time when you're investigating these like rendering techniques in order to figure out like the most clear and like simple version of something?
Yeah.
And how does like doing that possible research influence your work? And then how does it kind of come back to bear in the representation?
Yeah. Thanks for your question. It's very much about going back in time in all of these and reading a lot of like white papers and whatnot and looking at really terrible diagrams drawn by engineers. And what I think it's going back in time and just tracing, because they are scientific papers, the references and how that's developed, and trying to draw a diagram from that, if that makes sense. How that becomes interesting in research and maybe like a design project is I found that a lot of this stuff either comes from an entertainment industry, so like Disney or Warner Brothers, and the noise thing comes from, you know, like movies, or it comes from the military. So surveillance, form finding, reading images, and there's like a very sort of broad context, whether it's based more on aesthetics or more based on locative technology used to find people in a certain way. There's a kind of politics to it. So looking at the history of that is interesting for me, and thinking about the environment in a plastic way, but also the context becomes a bit more sinister, really.
So, okay, I'm going to sharpen this just a little. Jennifer, you're going to help me. So by comparison, think of like Andrew Kovacs, this sort of mashup. You guys know this this sort of mashup of pre-existing forms appropriated and then piled up to the point that some threshold is supposed to have been crossed. So that's one example. The other are Jennifer's roof projects. What are they called? The Atlanta roofs? Domestic acts. Hats. And what happens there is, and I don't know if you did them by hand, but I'm going to, I think you did in by comparison, that by hand, the roofs are processed, let's say, to the point, and they're totally recognizable, and in fact, literally appropriated or traced roofs, but they're processed to a point that a threshold is crossed where it almost as if you've somehow changed media or changed the parameters of a medium, and they no longer behave like domestic roofs. Whereas for me, for Kovacs, you never quite cross that threshold. There's something, it's still collage. It's still, you end up with patches of referential material, but it never interacts in such a way that you move beyond anything more than a collection of patches. Where do you fall, or where do you want to fall? I guess I was thinking in the Rice project, the one that Lisa was talking about, there was something, because there you do get a fuller palette of possibilities, because you get the wall, the paper on the wall, as well as the stairs and the openings and the windows. And to me, it starts to move into something. It's still very architectural and very, very legible, but it starts to move into something that there's still an overall controlling system, as I think is in Jennifer's roof, as opposed to patches. Yeah, that's what. Yeah. Whereas in other cases, there might still be residual patches. I'm not sure. And so, just would you put yourself in that kind of field of practice?
I'll answer it in a kind of roundabout way. I think I don't know the project super well, so it's really hard for me to talk about this. I'm feeling awkward, but I think the examples have a clear referent, right? Whether it's things or a roof, everyday object or domesticity. And so the relationship in making and understanding or reading has some kind of layer of ambiguity, meaning that there is a very clear referent. There's something that you're thinking about. The way I was thinking about that half-scale house was, I would say, characterized by something that's much more vague, which I think operates with reference in really different ways. That there is an approximate form, or there's a kind of approximate language, but that the specific referent is not so clear. That's really what I'm interested in, how to introduce this kind of idea of vagueness to maybe get away from the specificity of reference. And that's why I've been investigating these totalizing representational systems. Their abstraction, I think, helps that. And trying to define the formal specificity that is somewhat similar to familiar things instead of starting with the specific referent.
Yeah, I think that works in terms of, at least as a pursuit of, works with the Phil Spector mono saturated flat space, as opposed to that works there. Yeah. But that would lead you to very dense dumb, right? That the removal of referent it has a muting effect. Yeah. Which I'm not saying that you don't want, maybe someone like on the name arc wants dumb. That's the pursuit. Yeah, I'm just trying to understand it in the field.
I feel like it has to be a house.
Has to be a house.
Well, yeah, that's what's so amazing about that Rice project. Like, it has to be domestic, and part of what's uncanny about it is that it's exactly as you said. It's not specific. And in an architecture school, you can't have the intimate. You're not allowed to talk about intimate domestic space, like what actually happens in a home. So to have an intimate model of a house at half scale in an architecture school and have people peering at it is, I think, setting up a totally different conversation. I think a parallel conversation to the one about noise, but that can only happen through the processes that you're talking about. So I think it has to be the house in that sense, and legible as such, even if it's sort of
That's true.
smoothed out.
Yeah. Maybe
I have a question that kind of follows up on that, and I don't mean to use program as a foil for what is good or not, but you do have this kind of assumption in that page with the diagrams about the kind of significance of these things as being formulated from collective viewership.
Yeah.
So instead of a single subject, there are many subjects. So when it comes down then to getting an architectural end out of them, it's a single family house, which to me is actually something that is more about singular viewership, that potentially one client, occupant, might be perceiving this thing. So I was wondering what it means to you that it is a house, and then whether there are other kind of more what we would assume as collective programs that would benefit more from a kind of the collective viewership that you're talking about, and what this kind of reveals about even your personal politics potentially, and like kind of assumptions that we may have about the kind of significance of collective versus singular.
Yeah, thank you. Short answer maybe is I need to move away from single-family houses. I've been thinking about teaching my next studio on multifamily housing. I was just really into the politics of domestic space for a while, and so that's a parallel strand to all this like representational stuff and unpacking the politics of domestic space and how that becomes legible was worked through alongside a representational project. And I think the reason why that is so interesting, well, one, I think it's pretty manageable in a sense of scale, and there's a discrete set of spaces at different scales in a kind of network that is familiar to us without the burdening of, let's say, if the project were on multifamily housing, I think economics and how that would play out in the design of the building would be much more important to consider. I think it's just a little bit more manageable in that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I see a conference coming here, which we could convene on these issues, because I really do think we're starting to get enough people who in very different ways are pursuing, there is common ground. It's not absolutely clear to me how to find it, but some of it is technological, some of it I would say is following what Zena was saying about the transformational legacy of well, and even people like Scott, there's a transformational underpinning to this that's in place. There's a digital computational underpinning, but there's something else, and we could start to gather these people. And
can I ask you something?
Yeah.
I wanted to know if you thought that representational structures was a kind of schema or apparatus. Would you buy that as an argument? In that, as opposed to the pure aesthetic medium of representation that operates, on the plane, representational structures imply like a totalizing order that is somewhere between a kind of conceptual and perceptual. Do you see them that way at all? Or?
You've got to come back and take BTC again.
No,
only participate.
Okay, did I totally get it wrong?
No, but no. Participate this time, because one of the things that we're really trying to look at by really in class and together with the studio. The first semester studio here now in core is called Project. So, and we pair that with a historical look, but also a theoretical look at systems of projection like perspective and anamorphosis. And you use the word schema, which I think is exactly correct, that perspective is a schema, that in the Renaissance, it has political, historical, psychological, all kinds of implications that becomes the system that can hold a whole kind of episteme or a whole, worldview together.
Yeah.
And I think what maybe the common ground is this, partly the search is not is there one, but what are the possible, how did you call it? Yeah, schemas for our own time that are adequate to the representational demands of now. And I think that's a totally pursuable search. It's not only legitimate theoretically, it's actually, you can almost set up what the practical parameters of that would, at least in the beginning, be, and I think a number of you are. I do think, in the same way that anamorphosis in my mind is kind of a limit condition of perspective, where it starts to betray itself, or not betray itself, but getting under. That a lot of the same things that you, Zaina, Jennifer, others are pursuing is a similar kind of getting under. And and trying to, yeah. So I'm for it. I think that that's a, you know, there's a conference there or there's a discussion there that we shouldn't let escape us because you're far away in Houston. So thank you for coming so far
Thank you.
away.
Yeah,
and,
thanks so much.
You'll
This
come
was
back.
fun.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Michelle. Thank you.
Thanks.